Richard Coleman sat in his massive office overlooking the San Francisco skyline and rubbed his tired eyes. The meeting with Sophie's teacher had not gone well. Mrs. Patterson had used words like withdrawn and isolated and concerned. She said his 8-year-old daughter barely spoke in class anymore and spent lunch periods sitting alone under a tree. Richard felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. 2 years had passed since his wife Elizabeth died, and he thought time would heal everything. He thought keeping busy with work and maintaining their wealthy lifestyle would be enough. He was wrong. That evening, Richard came home early for once. Their mansion in Pacific Heights felt cold and empty despite its expensive furnishings. He found Sophie in her room doing homework with a sad expression that broke his heart. She looked up when he entered and gave him a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Richard sat on the edge of her bed and asked how school was. Sophie shrugged and said it was fine. He asked if she had made any new friends, and she shook her head. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment before Richard heard footsteps in the hallway. Grace Williams appeared in the doorway carrying fresh folded laundry. She was a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. When she saw Richard, she apologized for interrupting and started to leave, but Sophie called out to her. The child's face lit up in a way it hadn't when her father arrived. Grace came in and Sophie immediately started telling her about a book she was reading. Richard watched their easy interaction and felt like an outsider in his own daughter's life. After Grace left, Richard stayed with Sophie until bedtime. He read her a story but stumbled over the words because he didn't know which books were her current favorites. When he kissed her goodnight, Sophie hugged him tight and whispered that she missed Mommy. Richard felt tears sting his eyes as he held his daughter. He whispered that he missed her too. Walking downstairs, he found Grace in the kitchen cleaning up from dinner. She had worked for them for 6 years now, and Richard realized he knew very little about her beyond her excellent work. The next morning, Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. He called his assistant and told her to arrange meetings with 5 women he had been casually dating over the past year. These were women from his social circle who had made it clear they were interested in something serious. Richard had kept them at arm's length because he wasn't ready, but now he thought differently. Sophie needed a mother figure, and he needed help giving her one. But instead of choosing himself, he would let Sophie decide. It seemed like the fair thing to do since this affected her life more than his. Over the next week, Richard's assistant arranged everything. He owned a beautiful estate in Napa Valley that he rarely used, and it would be perfect for a weekend gathering. He explained his plan to each woman separately. He told Victoria Hayes, the former supermodel, that his daughter's happiness was his priority. He told Lauren Pierce, the successful attorney, that he wanted Sophie involved in the decision. He told Natalie Brooks, the famous architect, that this was unconventional but important. He told Caroline West, the celebrity chef, that family came first. He told Diane Murphy, the philanthropist heiress, that he valued Sophie's opinion above all else. Each woman agreed enthusiastically. They saw this as a unique opportunity and perhaps found the approach refreshingly honest. Richard felt satisfied with his plan. These were accomplished, sophisticated women who could provide Sophie with opportunities and experiences. They came from good families and understood his world of wealth and social obligations. Surely Sophie would connect with at least one of them. He imagined his daughter having a strong female role model who could guide her through life's challenges. He pictured family dinners and vacations and graduations with a complete family unit again. Richard sat Sophie down and explained what would happen. He told her that 5 very nice ladies would visit their Napa house for the weekend. He said these were women he knew and respected. He explained that Sophie could spend time with each of them, and at the end, she could choose which one she liked best. That woman would become part of their family. Sophie listened quietly and asked if she had to choose one. Richard said yes because he thought it would help them both move forward. Sophie nodded slowly, but didn't look excited. The days before the trip, Richard noticed Sophie spending more time with Grace. The housekeeper and his daughter were always together when he came home. They baked cookies in the kitchen and worked on craft projects at the dining table. Grace helped Sophie with her homework and listened to her practice reading aloud. Richard appreciated Grace's dedication but didn't think much of it. She was doing her job well, and Sophie clearly enjoyed her company. He was too focused on preparing for the weekend to see what was right in front of him. Grace herself seemed quieter than usual. Richard caught her watching Sophie with a sad expression once or twice. When he asked if everything was all right, Grace smiled and said yes. She asked when they would be leaving for Napa, and Richard told her the date. Grace nodded and went back to her work. Richard assumed she was just tired or perhaps dealing with something personal. He made a mental note to give her a bonus and some time off after the weekend. Good housekeepers were hard to find, and Grace was the best. Friday afternoon arrived and Richard packed the car. Sophie moved slowly and kept hugging Grace goodbye. The housekeeper knelt down and held Sophie close for a long moment. She whispered something in the girl's ear that Richard couldn't hear. Sophie nodded against Grace's shoulder. Richard called for Sophie and they drove away. In the rearview mirror, he saw Grace standing in the doorway watching them leave. Something about the scene felt significant, but Richard pushed the thought away. He had a plan and he was confident it would work. His daughter would choose a new mother from 5 excellent candidates, and their lives would return to normal. He had no idea that Sophie had already made her choice long ago. The Napa Valley estate looked perfect in the late afternoon sun. Richard had hired extra staff to prepare everything, and the house gleamed. Fresh flowers filled every room and the kitchen was stocked with food. Sophie wandered through the rooms touching things absently. She seemed nervous and Richard tried to reassure her. He told her this would be fun and she would like the ladies. Sophie just nodded and went to her room. Richard checked his watch and waited for his guest to arrive. Victoria Hayes came first in a sleek black car. She stepped out wearing designer clothes and oversized sunglasses. Her long legs and perfect posture showed her modeling background. She was 42 but looked 30. Victoria brought a huge gift bag filled with expensive items. She greeted Richard with air kisses and asked where the birthday girl was. Richard corrected her that it wasn't Sophie's birthday. Victoria laughed and said every day should feel like a celebration for a child. She seemed friendly enough, but Richard noticed how she checked her reflection in every mirror they passed. Lauren Pierce arrived next, driving herself in a luxury sedan. She wore a tailored suit even on the weekend and carried a leather briefcase along with a gift. Lauren was 38 and had built one of the most successful law practices on the West Coast. She shook Richard's hand firmly and asked intelligent questions about the estate. Her gift for Sophie was an expensive tablet loaded with educational apps. Lauren explained that children needed to start building skills early in today's competitive world. Richard appreciated her practical thinking, but wondered if Sophie would find her too serious. Natalie Brooks pulled up in a sports car that made Richard's vehicles look ordinary. She was 45 and had designed buildings in Dubai and Singapore and New York. Natalie had short, stylish hair and wore all black everything. Her gift was a professional architecture set with blueprint paper and drafting tools. She told Richard she believed in inspiring creativity in young minds. Natalie seemed artistic and interesting, but Richard wasn't sure an 8-year-old would understand her abstract way of speaking. Caroline West arrived with the most dramatic entrance. She came in a van filled with cooking equipment and ingredients. Caroline was 50 and had hosted cooking shows for 15 years. Her restaurants were famous worldwide. She immediately took over the kitchen and started preparing an elaborate dinner. Her gift for Sophie was a child-sized chef's uniform with Sophie's name embroidered on it. Caroline talked constantly about food and flavors and techniques. She seemed warm and energetic, but Richard wondered if her intensity might overwhelm Sophie. Diane Murphy was the last to arrive in a chauffeured limousine. She was 35 and had inherited her family's fortune at 21. Since then, she had devoted herself to charity work and social causes. Diane wore pearls and a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her gift was a donation made in Sophie's name to a children's hospital. Diane spoke eloquently about responsibility and giving back. Richard respected her values but worried she might be too formal for a child. Richard gathered everyone in the living room and explained the weekend's purpose again. The 5 women listened politely, though he could see calculation in their eyes. They were competing, and they knew it. Then Richard called for Sophie. His daughter came down the stairs slowly wearing a simple dress. She looked tiny compared to the glamorous women. Richard introduced each one and Sophie shook their hands quietly. The women smiled bright smiles and complimented Sophie's dress and hair and manners. Dinner that evening was an elaborate affair prepared by Caroline. She had made multiple courses with complicated names. The women sat around the long table trying to engage Sophie in conversation. Victoria talked about Fashion Week in Paris and offered to take Sophie shopping there. Lauren discussed the importance of education and mentioned private schools she had connections with. Natalie described buildings she had designed and promised to show Sophie her architectural models. Caroline explained each dish and asked if Sophie wanted to learn to cook. Diane talked about charity galas and suggested Sophie could help plan events. Sophie answered politely but briefly. She said yes ma'am and no ma'am and thank you. Her food remained mostly untouched on her plate. Richard watched his daughter and felt concerned. He had expected her to be at least a little excited. These women were offering her amazing opportunities. They were successful and intelligent and interested in her. But Sophie seemed to shrink further into herself with each passing minute. The women exchanged glances but kept trying. They were determined to win her over. After dinner, Richard suggested everyone relax in the living room. The women continued their charm offensive. Victoria showed Sophie photos on her phone of exotic locations. Lauren pulled out her tablet and demonstrated the educational games. Natalie sketched a building and let Sophie add details. Caroline brought out cookies she had baked. Diane talked about meeting celebrities at charity events. Sophie participated when asked but never initiated anything. She reminded Richard of a polite little robot going through motions. Around 8 o'clock, Richard noticed Sophie's eyes drooping. He announced bedtime and the women said goodnight with promises to spend more time together tomorrow. Richard walked Sophie upstairs and helped her get ready for bed. He asked what she thought of the ladies. Sophie said they seemed nice. Richard asked if she liked any of them specially. Sophie shrugged. Richard felt frustrated but tried not to show it. He kissed her forehead and turned off the light. Downstairs, the 5 women had opened wine and were talking freely. Richard joined them and they asked how he thought things were going. He admitted Sophie seemed shy but said she would warm up. Victoria suggested Sophie might be overwhelmed by so many new people at once. Lauren said children sometimes needed time to process. Natalie wondered if Sophie was naturally introverted. Caroline thought maybe the child was still grieving. Diane said patience was key. They all agreed to try different approaches tomorrow. Richard went to bed that night feeling uncertain. His plan had seemed so logical, but Sophie's reaction puzzled him. He had given her 5 excellent options and she showed interest in none of them. He told himself it was only the first day. Tomorrow would be better. The women would have more time with Sophie and surely she would connect with someone. He fell asleep thinking about how to make the weekend more successful. What Richard didn't know was that Sophie lay awake in her room. She was thinking about home and missing the one person who wasn't there. She clutched her pillow and wished she could talk to Grace. Grace would know what to say. Grace would understand how strange and uncomfortable this all felt. Grace would sit with her and listen without expecting anything in return. Sophie closed her eyes and counted the hours until they could go home. She had already made her choice and none of these fancy women were it. Saturday morning started with Caroline making an enormous breakfast. The kitchen filled with smells of pancakes and bacon and fresh bread. The 5 women had dressed casually, but their casual clothes probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They gathered around the table, chattering and laughing. Sophie came down looking tired, and Richard wondered if she had slept poorly. He put food on her plate, but she barely ate. The women tried engaging her again with questions about school and hobbies and favorite things. Sophie answered in short sentences. After breakfast, Victoria suggested a fashion show. She had brought several outfits and wanted Sophie to try them on. They went upstairs to Sophie's room and Victoria pulled out dresses and shoes. She talked about style and confidence and how clothes could make you feel powerful. Sophie tried on a few things and stood still while Victoria adjusted and accessorized. Victoria took photos and showed Sophie how pretty she looked. Sophie smiled weakly and said thank you. When Victoria wasn't looking, Sophie touched the simple dress hanging in her closet that Grace had helped her pick out for her mother's last birthday. That felt like a lifetime ago. Lauren took her turn next and set up a learning session in the study. She brought out books and puzzles and brain teasers. Lauren explained that intelligence was the greatest asset anyone could have. She talked about her own education and career. She told Sophie that women needed to be twice as smart to get half as far. Lauren meant well, but her intensity made Sophie uncomfortable. The child worked through the puzzles politely but without enthusiasm. Lauren praised her problem-solving skills and said she saw great potential. Sophie just nodded. Natalie claimed the afternoon and took Sophie outside with her architecture materials. She spread out papers on the patio table and showed Sophie how to draw building plans. Natalie talked about shapes and spaces and how structures could inspire emotions. She was passionate about her work and genuinely wanted to share it. Sophie tried to pay attention but kept looking toward the house. Natalie noticed and asked if something was wrong. Sophie said no and went back to drawing. Her sketch looked more like the home she missed than any famous building. Caroline's turn came next and she brought Sophie back to the kitchen. She tied the small chef's uniform on Sophie and showed her how to make cookies from scratch. Caroline explained each ingredient and let Sophie measure and mix. She talked about cooking as love and art combined. Caroline was gentler than the others and Sophie relaxed slightly. They made chocolate chip cookies and Caroline let Sophie lick the spoon. For a moment Sophie almost seemed happy. But then Caroline asked if her mother had liked to bake and Sophie's face fell. She whispered yes and went quiet again. Diane took the last slot before dinner and sat with Sophie in the garden. She talked about helping people and making the world better. Diane had a soft voice and kind manner. She asked Sophie what causes she cared about. Sophie said she didn't know. Diane suggested they could work together to find something meaningful. She painted a picture of attending charity events and meeting important people. Sophie listened, but her eyes kept wandering. She seemed to be looking for something or someone who wasn't there. Dinner was quieter that evening. The women were running out of tactics and Richard could see their frustration. Sophie had been polite to everyone but connected with no one. Richard felt his own frustration building. He had brought together 5 incredible women and his daughter acted like she was serving detention. After dinner he took Sophie aside and asked what was wrong. Sophie said nothing was wrong. Richard asked if she disliked the ladies. Sophie said they were nice. Richard asked then what was the problem. Sophie looked at her feet and said she missed home. Richard sighed and said they would go home tomorrow after she made her choice. That night Richard couldn't sleep. He went downstairs for water and found Natalie sitting in the living room. She said she couldn't sleep either. They talked quietly and Natalie asked if Sophie was always this withdrawn. Richard admitted she had been sad since her mother died but usually wasn't this distant. Natalie suggested maybe forcing a choice wasn't the right approach. She said children needed to feel safe and this situation might be creating pressure. Richard defended his plan but Natalie's words stuck with him. Maybe he had made a mistake. Sunday morning came too soon. The atmosphere felt tense and awkward. Everyone knew the decision was coming and no one felt confident. The women had tried everything and Sophie remained unreachable. They packed their things and gathered in the living room. Richard called Sophie down and she came slowly. He had planned a speech about this being an important decision, but looking at his daughter's scared face, he simplified. He knelt in front of her and took her hands. He said she could choose any of these 5 wonderful women to be part of their family. He said whoever she chose would be there for her like a mother. He asked if she understood and Sophie nodded. The room went silent. The 5 women sat perfectly still, trying to look approachable. Richard watched his daughter's face and saw something he hadn't expected. Sophie wasn't looking at any of the 5 women. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway to the kitchen. Richard turned and saw Grace standing there. He had forgotten that Grace had come to prepare meals and clean. She was part of the house staff, not part of the gathering, but Sophie's entire focus was on the housekeeper. Sophie's voice came out clear and strong. She said she chose Miss Grace. The words hung in the air like something physical. Richard stared at his daughter, certain he had misheard. Victoria laughed uncomfortably and said that was sweet but not what Daddy meant. Lauren frowned and looked confused. Natalie tilted her head, studying Sophie with new interest. Caroline's smile faded. Diane shifted in her seat. Richard found his voice and said Sophie needed to choose one of the 5 ladies. Sophie shook her head. She said she chose Miss Grace. She wanted Miss Grace to be her mom. Grace stood frozen in the doorway. Her face showed shock and something else Richard couldn't identify. Tears filled her eyes. She started to speak, but Sophie ran to her. The child wrapped her arms around Grace's waist and held on tight. Sophie said Miss Grace knew her. Miss Grace understood her. Miss Grace was there when she was sad or scared or lonely. Miss Grace was who she wanted. Grace looked over Sophie's head at Richard with an expression of panic and apology. She tried to gently push Sophie away, saying this wasn't how things worked. But Sophie wouldn't let go. The 5 women sat in stunned silence. Victoria recovered first and stood up smoothly. She said this had been an interesting weekend and made her exit with dignity. Lauren gathered her things quickly, looking embarrassed. Natalie watched the scene thoughtfully before leaving without comment. Caroline touched Richard's shoulder sympathetically on her way out. Diane paused and looked at Grace and Sophie for a long moment before quietly departing. Within minutes, Richard was alone with his daughter, still clinging to the housekeeper. Richard felt anger rising but didn't know where to direct it. He told Sophie to let go of Grace. Sophie shook her head. Richard said Grace was their employee, not a candidate. Sophie said she didn't care. Richard looked at Grace and saw her trying to unwrap Sophie's arms while apologizing repeatedly. Grace said she never meant for this and she would leave right away. She said she had overstepped and caused confusion. Richard told her to stop. Everyone stopped moving. The house fell completely silent except for Sophie's quiet crying against Grace's apron. Richard sat down heavily on the couch. His perfect plan had exploded spectacularly. His daughter had rejected 5 accomplished women for the housekeeper. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Grace still stood awkwardly with Sophie attached to her. She looked terrified of losing her job. Sophie looked terrified of losing Grace. Richard looked terrified of the entire situation. He rubbed his face and told everyone to sit down. They needed to talk about this, but he had no idea what to say. The drive back to San Francisco felt endless. Sophie sat in the back seat, quiet and sad. Richard gripped the steering wheel, trying to organize his thoughts. Grace had left separately after Richard told her they would discuss everything on Monday. The weekend had been a disaster, and Richard blamed everyone, including himself. He glanced at Sophie in the rearview mirror. Her face was turned toward the window, watching the landscape pass. She looked small and defeated. Richard wanted to be angry with her, but mostly he felt confused. That evening, Richard tried to talk to Sophie again. He sat on her bed while she got ready for sleep. He asked her why she had said what she said. Sophie climbed under her covers and looked at him with serious eyes. She asked if he wanted the truth. Richard said yes. Sophie took a breath and started talking. She said when Mommy got sick, Grace was the one who explained things in a way that made sense. She said when Mommy died, Grace held her while she cried for hours. She said when Daddy was always at work, Grace was the one who came to school events. She said Grace knew her favorite color and her least favorite food and the names of all her stuffed animals. Richard listened and felt each word like a knife. Sophie continued and her voice got stronger. She said Grace helped with homework every night. Grace made her lunch with little notes inside. Grace sang her the same songs Mommy used to sing. Grace braided her hair the way Mommy did. Grace remembered the stories Mommy told. Grace kept Mommy's memory alive when Daddy seemed to want to forget. Richard tried to interrupt, but Sophie kept going. She said the 5 fancy ladies were nice, but they didn't know her. They knew what Daddy told them. Grace knew her because Grace paid attention. When Sophie finished talking, she looked exhausted. Richard sat speechless. He had thought he was doing his best for his daughter. He had maintained their lifestyle and kept her in the best school. He had made sure she had everything she needed. But he hadn't made sure she had him. He had buried himself in work to avoid grief. He had convinced himself that providing financially was the same as providing emotionally. Sophie had been hurting and lonely and he hadn't even noticed. Grace had noticed. Grace had stepped in. Grace had given Sophie what her own father couldn't. Richard kissed Sophie's forehead and left her room. He poured himself a drink and sat in his study staring at nothing. His wife's photo smiled at him from the desk. Elizabeth had been warm and present and involved. She had made their house a home. After she died, Richard had let their house become just a building. He had let grief turn him into a ghost in his own life. Sophie had needed him, and he had offered money and eventually 5 strangers. No wonder his daughter preferred the housekeeper. Grace had been more of a parent than he had. Monday morning came, and Richard called his office to say he wouldn't be in. His assistant sounded shocked because Richard never missed work. He told her to reschedule everything. Then he called Grace and asked her to come at her usual time. Grace arrived looking nervous. She had probably spent the weekend thinking she would be fired. Richard met her at the door and asked her to sit with him. Grace perched on the edge of the couch like she might need to run. Richard didn't know how to start, so he just asked her to tell him about Sophie. Grace hesitated, then began talking. She told him about Sophie's nightmares that happened twice a week. She told him about Sophie's fear of thunderstorms since Elizabeth died. She told him about Sophie's trouble making friends at school. She told him about Sophie's love of drawing and her talent for it. She told him about Sophie's questions about heaven and death and where Mommy went. She told him about the tears and fears and small joys that filled Sophie's days. Richard listened and realized he knew almost none of this. He had been living in the same house as his daughter, but had no idea what her life was actually like. Richard asked Grace why she never told him. Grace looked uncomfortable and said it wasn't her place. She said he was always busy and she didn't want to bother him. She said she thought maybe he needed time to grieve his own way. Richard said he had been selfish and Grace protested. She said grief was hard and everyone handled it differently. Richard shook his head. He said grief was his excuse, not his reason. He had been a coward hiding in work instead of facing his daughter's pain and his own. Grace sat quietly, not knowing what to say. Richard asked Grace about herself. He realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who had been raising his child. Grace seemed surprised by the question. She told him about growing up in Jamaica and coming to America at 22. She told him about her late husband who died of a heart attack 5 years ago. She told him about her 3 grown children who she was proud of. She told him about working multiple jobs before finding steady work with families. She told him about loving children and finding purpose in caring for them. She told him about how Sophie reminded her of her own daughter at that age. Richard listened and felt ashamed. Grace had experienced loss too. She understood grief. She had built a life through hard work and dedication. She had her own family and her own story. Richard had seen her as just the housekeeper. He had reduced her to a function instead of seeing her as a person. But Sophie had seen her clearly. Children often did. They saw through surfaces to what was real. Grace was real. Grace was present. Grace was everything Richard had failed to be. He asked Grace what she wanted to do now. Grace said she didn't understand the question. Richard explained that Sophie had made her choice clear. Grace said Sophie was a child and didn't understand boundaries. Richard asked what if Sophie understood better than they did. Grace looked frightened. She said this couldn't work. She said she was the housekeeper and he was her employer. She said she came from nothing and he came from everything. She said people would talk and judge. She said Sophie would get hurt. She said 1,000 reasons why this was impossible. Richard let her finish, then asked one question. Did she love Sophie? Grace's eyes filled with tears. She said yes. She said Sophie had filled a hole in her heart after her husband died. She said caring for Sophie gave her purpose and joy. She said she loved that child like her own. Richard nodded. He said that was all that mattered. Grace shook her head, saying he didn't understand how the world worked. Richard laughed bitterly. He said he had just learned that he didn't understand how anything worked. He had thought wealth and status and connections were important. His daughter just taught him that love and presence and attention were what mattered. Grace had given Sophie those things. He had given Sophie everything except what she actually needed. Grace tried to argue, but Richard held up his hand. He said he needed time to think. He asked Grace to keep caring for Sophie as she had been. Grace agreed and went to start her work. Richard sat alone with his thoughts. Over the next few days, Richard did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He came home early. He helped Sophie with homework. He asked about her day and actually listened to the answers. He ate dinner with her instead of in his study. He read her bedtime stories. He sat with her during a thunderstorm and held her while she cried. He finally allowed himself to grieve with his daughter instead of hiding from her. Sophie slowly started opening up. She talked about missing her mother. She talked about being scared. She talked about feeling alone. Richard apologized for not being there. Sophie hugged him tight. Richard also watched Grace. He saw how she moved through their home with quiet efficiency. He saw how Sophie's face lit up when Grace entered a room. He saw the gentle touches and inside jokes between them. He saw the mother-daughter bond that had formed in his absence. Grace had given Sophie stability and love when Richard was too broken to provide either. She had asked for nothing in return except to care for a hurting child. Richard understood now why Sophie had chosen her. Grace was the obvious choice. She had been there all along. 2 weeks after the disastrous weekend, Richard made a decision. He called Grace into his study one evening after Sophie was asleep. Grace came in looking worried like she always did when he asked to speak privately. Richard gestured for her to sit, and this time she did without perching on the edge. He had been thinking constantly about Sophie's choice and what it meant. He had been watching how Grace and Sophie interacted. He had been evaluating his own failures as a father. Now he had a proposal, but he had no idea how Grace would react. Richard started by thanking Grace for everything she had done for Sophie. He said he finally understood how much she had given his daughter. Grace looked uncomfortable with praise as always. She said she was just doing her job. Richard shook his head. He said what she did went far beyond any job description. She had loved his daughter when he was too lost in grief to do it properly. She had kept his child together when he was falling apart. That wasn't a job. That was family. Grace's eyes widened at the word family. Richard took a breath and laid out his idea. He said Sophie had chosen Grace and maybe they should respect that choice. He said he wanted to change their arrangement completely. He didn't want Grace to be their housekeeper anymore. He wanted her to be Sophie's legal guardian. He wanted her to have real authority and respect as a parent figure, not just an employee. He would pay her a salary that reflected this new role. She would move into better quarters in the house. She would make decisions about Sophie's care alongside him. They would be co-parents in every real sense. Grace stared at him like he had lost his mind. She said this was crazy. She said people didn't do things like this. She said she was a housekeeper, not a socialite. She said his world and her world were completely different. She said Sophie would face judgment and questions. She said he would face criticism from his family and friends. She said this would never work. Richard listened to all her objections, then asked if she wanted it to work. Grace went silent. Her hands twisted in her lap. She said wanting didn't make things possible. Richard said he had spent 2 years thinking money and status could solve everything. His daughter just proved him wrong. Sophie wanted Grace because Grace showed up. Grace paid attention. Grace loved her without expecting anything in return. Those things mattered more than wealth or social position. Grace said the world didn't work that way. Richard said then maybe it was time to show the world a different way. Grace looked at him with tears in her eyes. She said she never meant to take Elizabeth's place. Richard's voice was gentle when he said she wasn't taking anyone's place. She was filling a space that had been empty too long. Grace asked what this would mean practically. Richard explained his vision. She would no longer do housework. They would hire someone else for that. She would focus entirely on Sophie and her well-being. She would attend school events and doctor appointments. She would make decisions about Sophie's schedule and activities. She would have access to whatever resources she needed. She would be treated as family, not staff. Grace said she didn't know how to be rich. Richard almost laughed. He said being rich hadn't made him a good father. Maybe not knowing how to be rich would help her stay a good mother. The conversation lasted hours. Richard answered Grace's questions and concerns. He acknowledged the difficulties they would face. He admitted his own family would probably react badly. His mother in Boston was very traditional and very judgmental. His business associates might not understand. Sophie's school might have questions. But Richard said he was tired of living by other people's rules. His wife died and grief had taught him that life was short. He wanted Sophie to be happy. Grace made Sophie happy. That was what mattered. Grace finally said she needed time to think. Richard nodded and said to take all the time she needed. 3 days passed. Grace went about her work quietly. Richard watched her struggle with the decision. Sophie noticed something was wrong and asked her father if Miss Grace was sick. Richard said no. Sophie asked if Miss Grace was leaving. Richard felt his heart clench at the fear in his daughter's voice. He said he hoped not. Sophie said if Miss Grace left, she would be so sad. Richard hugged his daughter and promised they would figure it out. That evening he found a note from Grace asking to talk. They sat in the study again. Grace looked like she hadn't slept well. She said she had thought about nothing else for 3 days. She said she had talked to her own children about it. Her daughter thought she was crazy. Her sons thought Richard was crazy, but all three agreed that if this was what Grace wanted, she should try. Grace said she had also prayed about it. She believed God put her in Sophie's life for a reason. Maybe this was that reason. She was terrified, but she was willing to try. Richard felt relief wash over him. They spent the next week working out details. Richard had his lawyer draw up paperwork making Grace Sophie's legal guardian. He changed her employment status and salary. He had the guest suite on the second floor renovated into proper living quarters for Grace. He sat Sophie down and explained that Miss Grace would be staying forever now. She wouldn't be the housekeeper anymore. She would be part of their family. Sophie's reaction was pure joy. She hugged her father and then ran to find Grace. Richard watched them embrace and felt he had finally done something right. The changes happened gradually. Grace moved into her new rooms and they felt strange at first. She was used to the small quarters in the back of the house. Richard hired a cleaning service to handle housework. Grace struggled with not doing those tasks anymore. Old habits were hard to break. Sophie helped by reminding Grace that she wasn't supposed to clean up. They made it into a game. Every time Grace automatically started tidying, Sophie would gently stop her. Grace would laugh and apologize. The transition was awkward, but they managed. Sophie's happiness was immediate and obvious. She had both her father and Grace now. Richard had started working less and being present more. Grace was there all the time without the barrier of being staff. Sophie bloomed. She talked more at dinner. She laughed easier. She started making friends at school. Her teacher called Richard to say whatever changes had happened at home were working beautifully. Richard thanked her and didn't explain. That would come later, but not everything was easy. Richard's assistant had questions about why Grace now had access to his calendar for Sophie's events. His business partners noticed he left meetings early for school pickups. His mother called after hearing rumors that the housekeeper was living upstairs now. Richard deflected most questions. He wasn't ready for the full explanation yet. He knew when people found out the truth there would be judgment. He was building his courage to face it. Grace faced her own challenges. Other parents at school drop-off clearly thought she was the nanny. She didn't correct them yet. Shopping for Sophie meant salespeople assumed she couldn't afford things. Grace had money now but didn't know how to act like she did. She still checked price tags and looked for sales. Sophie told her she didn't have to do that anymore. Grace said old habits died hard. The truth was Grace didn't want to change completely. She liked who she was. Money wouldn't change her values. One evening, Richard found Grace and Sophie baking cookies together in the kitchen. They were laughing about something and flour covered both of them. Richard watched from the doorway. This was what family looked like. Not fancy dinners or expensive gifts. Just time spent together doing ordinary things. Elizabeth would have loved this scene. She would have understood his decision immediately. She had always said people mattered more than appearances. Richard stepped into the kitchen and asked if he could help. Grace and Sophie looked surprised, then pleased. They handed him ingredients and taught him their recipe. The three of them worked together and made a mess and laughed. For the first time in 2 years, their house felt like home. A month into their new arrangement, Richard's mother announced she was coming to visit. Margaret Coleman was 70 years old and had very specific ideas about how the world should work. She had been born into wealth and married into more wealth. She valued tradition and appearances above almost everything. Richard had been avoiding telling her about Grace. Now he had no choice. He called his mother and tried to explain. Margaret listened in cold silence, then said she would arrive on Friday. Richard hung up feeling like he was 12 years old again and in trouble. He told Grace his mother was coming. Grace immediately looked worried. She asked what Margaret knew. Richard admitted he had tried to explain, but his mother had cut him off. Grace said maybe she should stay out of sight during the visit. Richard said absolutely not. Grace was part of their family now, and his mother needed to accept that. Grace didn't look convinced. Sophie overheard the conversation and asked if Grandma Margaret would be mean to Miss Grace. Richard assured her that wouldn't happen. But he wasn't certain himself. Friday arrived and Margaret's car pulled up exactly on time. She was a tall woman who dressed impeccably. Her hair was perfect and her jewelry was expensive. She swept into the house and greeted Richard with a cool kiss on the cheek. She looked around like she was inspecting for dust. Sophie came running and hugged her grandmother. Margaret's face softened slightly as she hugged Sophie back. Then Grace appeared from the kitchen to ask if anyone wanted coffee. Margaret's eyes fixed on her like a hawk spotting prey. Richard made introductions. He said this was Grace Williams and she was Sophie's guardian and part of their family now. Margaret's expression could have frozen fire. She said she wanted to speak with Richard alone. Sophie grabbed Grace's hand, looking scared. Grace told Sophie it was okay and led her toward the kitchen. Margaret watched them go with a frown. Once they were alone, she turned on Richard. She asked what he thought he was doing. Richard said he was doing what was best for Sophie. Margaret said he was making a fool of himself. The argument was intense and quiet. Margaret said people would talk. Richard said let them. Margaret said he was disrespecting Elizabeth's memory. Richard said Elizabeth would have understood. Margaret said he was confused by grief. Richard said grief had actually made him see clearly. Margaret said a housekeeper could never be part of their family. Richard said Grace already was. They went in circles for an hour. Finally, Richard told his mother she could accept the situation or leave. Margaret looked shocked that he would speak to her that way. She said she would stay for Sophie's sake, but this conversation wasn't over. Dinner that night was painfully awkward. Margaret barely spoke to Grace. She directed all her comments to Richard or Sophie. When Grace tried to join the conversation, Margaret would talk over her or change the subject. Sophie noticed and her face got sadder as the meal went on. Richard tried to smooth things over but made it worse. By dessert, everyone was miserable except Margaret, who seemed satisfied with her rudeness. After Sophie went to bed, Richard confronted his mother again. He told her she was being cruel. Margaret said she was being realistic. Grace knocked on the study door while they were arguing. She asked to speak. Margaret looked annoyed, but Richard invited her in. Grace stood straight and spoke clearly. She said she understood Margaret's concerns. She said she came from a different world. She said she never expected to be in this position. But she loved Sophie and Sophie needed her. She wasn't trying to replace Elizabeth. She wasn't trying to marry Richard. She was simply being there for a child who had lost her mother. Grace said if Margaret couldn't accept that, then Grace would step back. Sophie's well-being came first. Margaret studied Grace for a long moment. She asked Grace about her background. Grace answered honestly about growing up poor in Jamaica and working hard all her life. Margaret asked about her own children. Grace spoke proudly of her daughter, the nurse, and her sons, the teacher and soldier. Margaret asked why Grace thought she could fit into their world. Grace said she didn't think she could. She said she would probably always feel out of place. But Sophie didn't care about that. Sophie just needed someone who loved her. Margaret was silent for a while. Then she said she needed time to think and left for the guest room. The next morning, Richard woke to voices in the kitchen. He found his mother and Grace sitting at the table drinking coffee. They were talking quietly. When Richard entered, they both looked up. Margaret said she and Grace had been having a conversation. Richard sat down cautiously. Margaret said she had spent all night thinking. She admitted her initial reaction was based on pride and appearances. Those were the values she was raised with. But watching Sophie last night reminded her of something important. Her own son had nearly destroyed himself with grief. Sophie had been drowning too. Grace had saved them both. Margaret said she still thought this situation was highly unusual. She said people would judge and gossip. She said there would be challenges. But she could see that Grace genuinely loved Sophie. She could see that Sophie was happier than she had been in 2 years. Margaret said she valued tradition, but she valued family more. If this was what her son and granddaughter needed, then she would support it. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Richard felt a weight lift from his chest. Margaret held up a hand and said she had conditions. Grace and Richard both tensed. Margaret said Grace needed proper clothes for school events. She said Grace needed to learn how to navigate their social circles. She said if they were doing this, they would do it right. What followed was the strangest month of Grace's life. Margaret took over like a military general. She brought in a personal shopper who filled Grace's closet with appropriate clothes. Grace protested the expense, but Margaret dismissed her concerns. She said people would judge Grace's appearance, so they needed to remove that ammunition. Margaret taught Grace about the social rules of their world. Which forks to use at fancy dinners, how to make small talk at charity events, when to speak and when to listen. Grace felt like she was learning a foreign language. Sophie thought it was funny watching Miss Grace learn fancy manners. Grace would practice walking in heels around the house and Sophie would giggle. Grace would try to remember which wine glass was which and get confused. Margaret was a strict teacher, but Grace was a dedicated student. She wanted to protect Sophie from as much judgment as possible. If learning to act like a wealthy person would help, then Grace would learn. But she drew some lines. She refused to change her accent or her direct way of speaking. She refused to pretend she came from money. She was who she was. Richard watched the transformation with mixed feelings. He didn't want Grace to change too much. He liked her honesty and warmth, but he understood his mother's logic. Their social world was judgmental and unforgiving. Grace needed armor to survive it. Margaret seemed to genuinely respect Grace's willingness to learn. She told Richard one night that Grace had more dignity than most of the wealthy women she knew. Grace didn't pretend to be something she wasn't. She simply adapted what she needed to adapt and kept the rest of herself intact. The real test came when Sophie's school held parent night. Richard and Grace went together as Sophie's guardians. Margaret insisted on coming too for moral support. They walked into the school and every head turned. Other parents whispered behind their hands. Sophie's teacher looked surprised to see Grace in a parental role rather than as hired help. Richard introduced Grace as Sophie's guardian. The teacher was polite but clearly confused. During the presentation, other parents kept glancing at them. Some looked curious, some looked disapproving. Sophie sat between Richard and Grace, holding both their hands, looking nervous. After the presentation, parents mingled over refreshments. A few people approached to ask questions. Richard explained simply that Grace was part of their family and helped raise Sophie. He didn't elaborate. Some people accepted this. Others clearly didn't approve but were too polite to say so directly. One woman made a comment about how unusual the arrangement was. Margaret stepped in smoothly. She said families came in all forms and what mattered was the child's happiness. The woman backed down, faced with Margaret's authority. Richard felt grateful for his mother's presence. Sophie's teacher pulled them aside before they left. She said she had noticed a dramatic improvement in Sophie's behavior and schoolwork. Sophie was more engaged and happier. The teacher said whatever they were doing at home was working. She looked at Grace when she said this. Grace thanked her quietly. The teacher asked if Grace would be attending future events. Grace looked at Richard. He said yes, Grace would always attend. She was Sophie's guardian. The teacher nodded and said she was glad Sophie had such a strong support system. It wasn't enthusiastic approval, but it wasn't rejection either. In the car going home, Sophie was excited. She said she was proud that both Daddy and Miss Grace came. She said some kids only had one parent there. She had two. Margaret smiled from the front seat. Richard and Grace exchanged glances in the back. They had survived their first public appearance as a family. There would be more challenges ahead, but they had gotten through this one. Sophie fell asleep on the drive home with her head on Grace's shoulder. 6 months had passed since Sophie chose Grace. The autumn air was cool and leaves covered the ground outside their San Francisco home. Sophie turned 9 years old and the change in her was remarkable. She smiled constantly and talked about everything. Her teacher said she had become one of the most engaged students. She had made several close friends who came over for playdates. The quiet, withdrawn child from a year ago had transformed into a happy, confident girl. Richard and Grace watched this transformation with satisfaction. They had done this together. Richard had changed too. He still ran his company, but work no longer consumed him. He left the office at reasonable hours. He attended every school event. He cooked dinner with Sophie and Grace twice a week. He had learned to braid Sophie's hair, though not as well as Grace. He read books about parenting and grief and blended families. He went to therapy to process Elizabeth's death properly. He was learning to be the father Sophie needed. His business associates noticed the change. Some approved. Others thought he had gone soft. Richard didn't care what they thought anymore. Grace had settled into her role completely. She no longer felt like an imposter in the big house. She had found her place. She still struggled sometimes with the wealth and privilege. She still felt uncomfortable at fancy events. But she had learned to navigate Richard's world while keeping her own values. She volunteered at Sophie's school and at a community center in her old neighborhood. She wanted Sophie to understand that privilege came with responsibility. Sophie often came with her to volunteer. The girl was learning to see beyond her own comfortable world. Margaret had become an unexpected ally. She visited often and had grown genuinely fond of Grace. She told her friends about the arrangement and defended it fiercely when anyone criticized. Margaret said she had learned that family was about love, not bloodlines. She said Grace had taught her granddaughter values that money couldn't buy. Margaret's influence helped shift opinions in their social circle. People who respected her began accepting the situation. It wasn't universal acceptance, but it was progress. Sophie's birthday party was a small gathering of close friends. Grace and Richard planned it together. They decided on a simple party at home rather than an elaborate event. Sophie wanted to play games in the backyard and eat pizza. No fancy catering or entertainment. Just kids being kids. Grace made a cake from scratch with Sophie's help. Richard set up decorations and games. Margaret came early to help. They worked together like a real family. The party was loud and chaotic and perfect. Kids ran everywhere. Pizza disappeared in minutes. The cake was delicious. Sophie's friends all knew and liked Grace. They called her Miss Grace and asked her questions and sought her comfort when someone fell down. To these children, Grace was simply Sophie's other parent. They didn't see anything strange about it. Richard watched the children play and thought about how much adults could learn from kids. Kids saw people for who they were. They didn't care about race or class or social rules. They cared about kindness and fun, and who gave the best hugs. After the party ended and the guests left, Sophie gave Grace and Richard a drawing she had made. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house. The tallest figure had yellow hair like Richard. The medium figure had dark skin like Grace. The smallest figure with pigtails was Sophie. Above the drawing, Sophie had written "Our family" in careful letters. Grace's eyes filled with tears. Richard put his arm around her shoulders. Sophie asked if they liked it. They both said they loved it. Sophie said she wanted to hang it in the kitchen so everyone could see. Richard said that was perfect. That evening, after Sophie was in bed, Richard and Grace sat in the living room. They were both exhausted but content. Richard said he never imagined his life would look like this a year ago. Grace said neither did she. Richard asked if she was happy. Grace thought about it. She said happy was complicated. She was grateful for Sophie. She was glad they had formed a family. But she still faced prejudice regularly. She still felt like an outsider sometimes. She still missed her late husband. Happiness wasn't simple or constant. But yes, overall she was happy. Richard understood. His own happiness was mixed with grief for Elizabeth and regret for lost time. But he was grateful for what they had built. They talked about the future. Sophie would keep growing. She would face more challenges as she got older. Questions about her unusual family would get harder. Richard and Grace would have to help her navigate an identity that didn't fit neat categories. Grace said Sophie was strong. She had chosen love over convention at 8 years old. That kind of wisdom would serve her well. Richard said Sophie had learned that wisdom from Grace. Grace shook her head. She said Sophie had taught them all something important. She had reminded them what truly mattered. Weeks turned into months. Winter came and went. Spring arrived with new flowers and warmer days. Sophie thrived in school. She discovered a love of art and spent hours drawing. Grace encouraged this and set up a small studio space in one of the unused rooms. Richard commissioned a local artist to give Sophie lessons. The girl's talent was genuine. Her drawings often featured her family in various situations. Each one hung proudly on the walls. Their house became a gallery of Sophie's vision of their lives together. Richard's business faced a challenge when a major investor expressed concerns about his personal life. The man said Richard's unconventional family arrangement reflected poor judgment. Richard calmly told the investor to withdraw his money. He said anyone who judged his family wasn't someone he wanted to work with. The investor backed down, shocked. Richard's assistant later told him the story had spread through business circles. Some people thought he had gone crazy. Others admired his principles. Richard found he didn't care either way. There were more important things than business. Grace's own children visited during summer. They were curious to meet Sophie and see their mother's new life. Grace was nervous about the visit. She worried her kids would disapprove or feel replaced. But her daughter hugged Sophie immediately and declared her adorable. Her sons taught Sophie card games and jokes. They told Richard he was lucky to have their mother helping raise his daughter. They told Grace she deserved this happiness after everything she had been through. The visit was a success. Sophie gained extended family, and Grace relaxed knowing her children supported her choice. Sophie's school held a family heritage project where students had to present their family history. Sophie stressed about this for days. Her family didn't fit the usual template. Grace and Richard helped her work through it. Sophie decided to present both the Coleman family history and the Williams family history. She talked about her mother Elizabeth, who died. She talked about her father's business success. She talked about Grace's journey from Jamaica. She talked about Grace's children who served others. She talked about how families could be made, not just born. Her presentation was honest and heartfelt. Some parents looked uncomfortable. Some looked moved. Sophie's teacher gave her the highest grade and said her project showed real understanding of what family meant. Time continued passing. Sophie turned 10. The family took a vacation together to Jamaica so Sophie could see where Grace grew up. They visited Grace's hometown and met distant relatives. Sophie learned about her history and culture. She tasted traditional foods and heard old stories. She saw the house where Grace was raised. She understood better where Grace came from and what she had overcome. The trip deepened their bond. Sophie came home with a broader view of the world and her place in it. One evening, Richard found Grace looking at old photos. She had a picture of her late husband in her hands. Richard asked if she was all right. Grace said she was thinking about how strange life was. 5 years ago, she was grieving her husband and working to survive. Now she was part of a wealthy family helping raise a child who wasn't hers. She said she never could have imagined this path. Richard said he couldn't have imagined it either. But he was grateful for it. Grace said so was she. They sat together in comfortable silence. Sophie came running in excited about something she had read. She climbed onto the couch between Richard and Grace. She started explaining a book about families around the world. She said some families had 2 moms or 2 dads. Some had grandparents raising kids. Some had adopted children. Some had step-parents. Families were all different shapes. Sophie said their family was special but not weird. Lots of families didn't look traditional. Grace and Richard exchanged smiles over her head. Sophie had figured out what they were still learning. The story of their family spread beyond their immediate circle. A local journalist heard about them and asked for an interview. Richard was reluctant, but Grace thought it might help other families in similar situations. They agreed to talk. The article appeared weeks later. It was honest about the challenges they faced, but focused on the love they shared. It quoted Sophie saying she felt lucky to have 2 people who loved her so much. The article got mixed reactions. Some people sent supportive messages. Others sent hateful ones. Richard wanted to respond to the hate. Grace said to focus on the support. The hate said more about the haters than about their family. Years would pass. Sophie would grow into a teenager and then an adult. 3 months after Grace officially became Sophie's guardian, a problem emerged. Sophie's best friend Lily invited her to a birthday party. Sophie was excited until she learned it was at a country club. She came to Richard worried. She said the club might not let Miss Grace in. Richard was confused until Sophie explained that Lily's older sister had told her some clubs had rules about who could enter. Sophie was scared Miss Grace would be turned away and embarrassed. Richard felt anger rise in him. He had been so focused on their home life that he hadn't thought about the broader world's prejudices. He called the country club and spoke to the manager. He asked directly about their membership and guest policies. The manager gave careful non-answers. Richard understood what wasn't being said. He told the manager his family wouldn't be attending any events there. Then he called Lily's mother and explained. The woman was apologetic. She said she hadn't thought about it. She offered to move the party to a different location. Richard appreciated the gesture but declined. He said Sophie would attend, but he would drop her off and Grace would pick her up. That way there would be no issues. Richard hung up and sat with his head in his hands. He had been naive. He thought because he was wealthy and powerful that Grace would be protected by association. But money didn't erase certain prejudices. Grace had been right when she said they came from different worlds. He just hadn't understood how much that would matter. When Grace came home from grocery shopping, Richard told her what happened. Grace didn't look surprised. She said she had lived with this her whole life. She said she had prepared herself for it when she agreed to this arrangement. Richard said it wasn't fair. Grace said fair had nothing to do with it. That evening, Richard did something he should have done months ago. He asked Grace to tell him about her experiences. Grace was hesitant at first. She didn't want to make him uncomfortable. Richard insisted. So Grace talked. She told him about being followed in expensive stores. She told him about people assuming she was the help even when she wasn't working. She told him about subtle and not so subtle discrimination she faced regularly. She told him about her sons being stopped by police for no reason. She told him about her daughter being passed over for promotions despite her qualifications. She told him about a lifetime of being judged by her skin before people heard her words. Richard listened and felt ashamed of his ignorance. He had lived in a bubble of privilege. He had never had to think about these things. Grace said she wasn't telling him to make him feel guilty. She was telling him so he would understand what Sophie might face. People would judge their family. People would make assumptions. People would say cruel things. If Richard wasn't prepared for that, he needed to be. If he couldn't handle it, then they should reconsider the arrangement. Richard said he could handle it. Grace asked if he was sure. She said being aware and being ready were two different things. The next few weeks tested Richard's resolve. At a business dinner, a colleague made a comment about Richard's unusual living situation. The man said it in a joking tone, but the underlying judgment was clear. Richard responded coldly that his family arrangements were none of the man's business. The colleague backed off, but Richard knew the story would spread. At Sophie's school, a mother made a pointed comment to Grace about how nice it must be to live in such a big house. Grace answered politely, but Richard saw the hurt in her eyes. He wanted to defend her, but Grace touched his arm and shook her head. She could fight her own battles. Sophie started asking questions. She wanted to know why some kids' parents didn't like Miss Grace. She wanted to know why people stared at them. She asked if it was because Miss Grace was black and they were white. Richard and Grace had avoided directly discussing race with Sophie. She was only 8 and they wanted to protect her innocence. But Sophie was smart and observant. She saw what was happening. They sat her down and tried to explain. Richard said some people had small minds and judged others by appearances. Grace said some people were raised to think certain people were less important. Sophie asked if that was true. Grace said no. All people were equal. But not everyone believed that. Sophie thought about this for a long time. Then she asked what they should do when people were mean. Grace said they should be kind anyway. Sophie asked why they should be kind to mean people. Grace explained that responding to hate with hate only created more hate. But responding to hate with dignity and grace changed things slowly. Sophie wasn't satisfied with this answer. She said it wasn't fair that Miss Grace had to be nice to people who were mean to her. Richard agreed it wasn't fair. But life wasn't always fair. What mattered was how they responded to unfairness. The situation came to a head at a charity event Margaret insisted they attend. It was a fundraiser for children's hospitals and Margaret was on the board. She wanted the whole family there, including Grace. Richard was reluctant, but Margaret said hiding Grace would only feed gossip. They needed to face society head-on. So they went. Richard and Grace and Sophie all dressed formally. Margaret greeted them at the door and introduced them to everyone as her family. Some people were polite. Some were coldly polite. A few were openly rude. One woman made a loud comment about how things had certainly changed since her day. Another man asked Richard if he was making some kind of political statement. A group of women whispered while staring at Grace. Sophie held Grace's hand tight. Grace kept her face calm and pleasant. She made small talk and thanked people for their donations to the hospital. She didn't respond to the rudeness. Richard wanted to leave. He wanted to shield Grace and Sophie from these people. But Grace whispered that leaving would be running away. They needed to stay. The evening dragged on. Sophie got tired and cranky. Grace took her to a quiet corner and they sat together. A few genuinely kind people came over to talk. One woman said she thought what their family was doing was beautiful. Another couple said they admired their courage. An older man told Grace his own family had faced judgment years ago when his parents married across religious lines. He said love always won in the end. These moments helped, but the negative ones stuck more. By the time they left, Richard was exhausted. Grace was quiet. Sophie was asleep in Richard's arms. In the car, Margaret said she was proud of them. She said they had handled themselves with dignity. She admitted the evening had been harder than she expected. She said she had been shielded from the worst of people's prejudices by her position. Seeing how they treated Grace opened her eyes. Margaret apologized to Grace for not understanding before. Grace said it was all right. Margaret said no, it wasn't, but she promised to do better. She promised to use her influence to make their path easier. Grace thanked her quietly. Richard carried Sophie inside and put her to bed. Grace followed to help. Sophie woke up enough to mumble that the party wasn't fun. Grace smoothed her hair and said not all parties were. Sophie asked if people would always be mean. Grace said some would. But some would be kind. Sophie had to remember the kind ones. Sophie asked if Miss Grace was sad. Grace said sometimes, but not right now. Right now she was exactly where she wanted to be. Sophie smiled and fell back asleep. Richard and Grace stood watching her for a moment. Outside Sophie's room, Richard finally let his anger show. He said he wanted to protect them from this. Grace said he couldn't protect them from the world. The world was what it was. Richard said it wasn't good enough. Grace agreed. She said that was why they had to keep going. They had to show people that families could look different and still be full of love. They had to prove that what mattered was how you treated each other, not what you looked like. Richard asked if it was worth it. Grace looked back at Sophie's sleeping form. She said yes. It was absolutely worth it. Richard realized Grace was stronger than him. She had been dealing with prejudice her whole life and still led with kindness. She had every reason to be bitter but chose Grace instead. Her name fit her perfectly. Richard told her this. Grace smiled sadly. She said she had her moments of anger and pain, but she couldn't let them win. She had children watching her. She had Sophie watching her. She needed to show them how to be better than the hate they faced. Richard said he was learning from her. Grace said they were learning from each other. That was what family did.